People say there are only two things that are inevitable in life, death and taxes. Censorship is inevitable. I think we can really genuinely, sincerely say that censorship is inevitable. And if you live in a democracy, debates about what should and should not be censored are therefore inevitable also. I think, well, I was going to say, I think it is amusing. To be more honest to say, it is amusing to me that today we have this phenomenon of the alt-left catching up with and considering political issues that consumed the alt-right 5 years ago, in some cases more like 8 years ago. They're really behind the trend. And today I'm responding to controversy, raising the most fundamental questions of the significance of censorship in a democracy. It's going on between T.J. Kirk and people whom he now regards as his more successful competitors. And I could say channeling the energy of the new alt-left. People he regards as more extreme left-wing demagogues than himself, which is somewhat hilarious to hear. Doubtless including people like Jimmy Dore and Kyle Kulinski, who's named explicitly, so on and so forth. What a world we live in, where Kyle Kulinski can be considered some kind of firebrand leftist. You know what I mean? Shout out to the people showing up in the audience. This is a completely spontaneous, unannounced video, so it's nice if anyone shows up. Sometimes I give you guys advance notice. Sometimes I don't. Nice to see you, Wild Style. We're broadcasting at the perfect time for my viewers who are in Australia and New Zealand. Alexa, what's the time in Adelaide, Australia?
In Adelaide, it's 1:47 p.m.
Perfect timing for all my big fans in Adelaide. Some of them, my biggest fans, live in Adelaide, Australia. You might not know this. All right. So I just want to say, most of you guys, oh, good. Yeah, this viewer is indeed in New Zealand. All right. Glad to hear it. Back when I lived in China, I was broadcasting on New Zealand time pretty much every day. So I used to say that all the time. I'm going to build up a huge audience in New Zealand. And what I ended up doing was building up an audience in Sweden for whatever reason. I had way more viewers in. Way more viewers in Sweden than in New Zealand by the end of that exercise. So look, guys, there's the background of the amazing atheist going into the situation. The background of Kyle Kulinski, I think, is not even worth talking about. Could come up. And, there's my background also as a commentator. I'm certainly someone who has also criticized the amazing atheist. The amazing atheist, in some ways, is one of the great innovators who defined the rules of the game and went on to break all the rules of the game, so on and so forth. The amazing atheist, I feel, comes into this discussion with the most painful sort of disadvantage because he is ignorant of the people of whom he speaks. The amazing atheist refers so confidently to the possibility that in future we would have a branch of government staffed entirely by scientists who would be competent to determine objectively what is and what is not the truth, what should and what should not be censored. Now, he does a good job of making this unpalatable argument seem palatable. And he is not someone who is entirely unlearned and unread. He digresses to talk about the history of Germany and World War II. He digresses to talk about different kinds of fascist, extremist, and communist, worst case scenarios where the government has this power to control who can and cannot complain, in effect. The use of freedom of speech. And he, inframes his own argument in this way to seem moderate and to seem reasonable. But it all relies on this notion of the personal virtue of scientists, as if scientists were people very much different from religious leaders, whom he vilifies, as if scientists were people very much different from politicians, and they're not. Now, I made a video that I'm sure none of you were thinking of in this context. Sorry, I said there's the amazing atheist background and there's my background. I have made videos boldly taking up an unpopular position in favor of censorship. Although in this video, paradoxically, I'm in the opposite position because I'm arguing against the amazing atheist pro-censorship position. But I do argue regularly in favor of censorship. And it comes up, I live in a very left-wing context. Most of the people who talk to me are left-wing, and they consider me relatively conservative or relatively right-wing compared to them. If I moved to Texas, I'd be considered left-wing, but if you live around a whole bunch of, vegan Bernie Sanders supporters, I might seem conservative compared to some of the company I keep, etc. But, I have a background. We were talking about the state in a very different way. I've been surrounded by people with PhDs my whole life. I am painfully aware that formal education is not a substitute for virtue, and formal education is not virtue unto itself. Someone like the Amazing Atheist, who, he genuinely is a self-made man. He got rich, with nothing but a bad haircut and a bad attitude here on YouTube. He was one of the few kind of pathfinders. He was one of the few people who redefined the medium, defined the rules of the game, went on to break them, so on and so forth. Do you really think the Amazing Atheist has spent enough time in universities? Do you think he spent enough time talking face-to-face with laboratory scientists to realize just how fallible and just how human they truly are? I don't think he's even gone out to the bar with those people. I don't think he's seen those people drunk. I don't think he's seen them sober. And when he reads the history of the world, which he does, he's not completely unlearned. He's an autodidact. He's done some reading. When he reads, for example, the history of the Nazi Party in Germany, he doesn't see that as part of the history of science. He doesn't see the extent to which the true believers, the supporters of German fascism, German extremism, were in fact themselves scientists, were themselves the most highly formally educated people in the country. Now, I can say exactly the same thing about the history of communism, by the way. It's just not the case that in Russia or in China, communism was exclusively or even predominantly supported by uneducated peasants, by the least educated and most oppressed people. It's actually a constant source of embarrassment for the communists, and they have to come up with complex Jesuitical explanations for why it is that actually they were mostly supported by bourgeois intellectuals and kind of elite university educated people. There were no end of the scientists who were supporting communism in the most extreme, most terrible forms of communism. Scientists aren't merely fallible. In some ways, they are much worse people than the religious leaders whom T.J. Kirk finds it so easy to vilify. Hey guys, I am seeing your comments come in, but if they're not entirely relevant to the conversation, if they're not entirely fascinating to me, I won't necessarily reply. But thank you for being here, and thanks for commenting. And you're welcome to contribute to the conversation. You're welcome to distract me, and you're welcome to contradict me or criticize me while we're doing this live. You're also welcome to hit the thumbs up button, by the way. Maybe some more people will discover this. Maybe TJ Kirk himself will join us. He has nothing better to do, and I sent out the alert to him. So, in fact, I'm absolutely certain he has nothing better to do. If any of you want to, on Twitter or even on his Tumblr, he used to answer me on his Tumblr. I remember I talked to him a couple times on Tumblr. Send him a message on Twitter. Say, hey, there's a guy having a meaningful discussion of censorship and your position on it on YouTube. Maybe he can come and join the audience. So invite people if you know anyone to invite, including, you can invite TJ Kirk. Okay, so in his 2 videos he's made about this so far, he made one video and then he responded to criticism nowadays. He appeals to your sentimentality. He appeals to your prejudices in the audience by presenting it as a self-evident fact that scientists are morally good, whereas religious leaders are morally evil. Now, babe, why don't you hand me your book about, the book about antidepressants and so on. Sorry, just say, yeah. We're living through, this book is titled, I guess, all right, let's just stick to endorsing one book at a time here. Anyway, the book about the very recent and still unfolding history of scientists and medical doctors forcing millions of people to take drugs that have absolutely no scientifically provable medical benefit, and on the other hand, have very real side effects. So-called antidepressants, psychiatric treatments of various kinds that have been debunked, but also make millions of dollars. This is a book that shows the fallibility and bias of institutional science and individual scientists and medical experts on a massive scale, and in a way that's ruined millions of people's lives. Part of what I'm saying to you is, this is not the exception to the rule. This is the rule. Okay. Now, it's one type of science. I've also spent my life around people who did social science research. Talk about a problem like gambling. There are people with PhDs, whether it's in political science or in psychology or psychiatry, or people who spin out all kinds of theories about gambling and what we can do to help gamblers. I'm absolutely certain there's some scientist somewhere who's got a thesis that's worth a lot of money that the best way to help gamblers is to get them hooked on Xanax, get them hooked on benzodiazepines or antidepressants or something. Well, we have to understand gambling as a nervous disorder, has to do with anxiety, and come up with some excuse to get them on expensive, brain disabling, chemical treatments, mind altering drugs. I'm sure there are all kinds of different theories. Who really knows more about gamblers and gambling and what they're going through? Scientists or Christian preachers? It's real easy to vilify these people, TJ. And TJ, I am more of an atheist than you are, right? I'm a self-identified nihilist. I take atheism as perhaps much further than TJ does. And sorry, TJ, if you ever somehow end up watching this video, I know this, you will scoff at that. You will say, that's ridiculous. How could you possibly be more atheistic than me or more nihilistic than me? Well, if you start watching a few more videos on this channel, you'll figure it out, all right? I'm willing to make political commitments you are not willing to make in terms of actually destroying religion on planet Earth, actually making progress, not 500 years from now. I'm willing to take very bold steps in that direction that I know you're not. I respect your position. I've heard you explain your position. You're not. Okay. As easy as it may be to vilify the humble Christian preacher, okay, he lives among the people and he helps the poor and the weak and the downtrodden in a way that you don't, TJ. All right. TJ, have you ever helped an alcoholic overcome his alcoholism? Have you ever helped a gambling addict overcome his gambling addiction? And of course, I don't believe prayer works. I don't believe quoting the Bible to them is any more effective than quoting Shakespeare or some secular philosopher. Like if you quote the Bible and it's a good quote, it could have an effect on someone who's a gambling addict or an alcoholic, but not because of any divine agency. You managed to find something meaningful. You could also find something in Shakespeare or any well-written book, that Buddhist philosophy, you name it. You could give someone an uplifting quote or guidance. But caring for people and seeing the reality of their problems. I know this is going to sound ridiculous, but even if you think about a problem like obesity, religious leaders who live in the community and help people with their problems and talk to them, they know about obesity too. They know about obesity, drug addiction, alcoholism, gambling. They know about these things in a way that scientists do not. They all their lives long are students of human nature, and they know the sorrow and the agony of really trying to help people. And I say again, prayer doesn't work. The drugs don't work either. Now, there are scientists and there are individual scientific studies completely debunking Prozac, for example. Prozac is one specific SSRI antidepressant. There are. Let me ask, TJ Kirk, the amazing atheist, if you had your way in this world, if you were able to bring about this reform you're describing, whereby a council of scientists would sit down and decide the difference between truth and falsehood, whereby they would rule in the public's interest on what people are and are not allowed to say. I think we have ample evidence that still today, your scientists would establish it as a fact that everyone should be taking Prozac, that Prozac is helpful and not harmful, when we know this is not true. Who's we? A tiny minority, a minority of dissident people who are willing to do the research and challenge the status quo. We know it's actually a proven fact that Prozac doesn't work, that it has real harmful side effects and either zero benefit or a benefit so small that it can be confused with a placebo effect, et cetera, et cetera. So it's either incredibly marginal benefit comparable to placebo effect or no benefit at all, and the harm done to you is very real. How about circumcision, TJ? Is it what you would call an uncontrovertible scientific fact that circumcision does harm? I remember being shocked to see it. And now, decades later, I heard people talking about it on YouTube. I've seen the official opinion of the American College of Physicians and Surgeons reassuring you that circumcision is completely harmless and completely acceptable, that it shouldn't be illegal, that it's, that the benefits outweigh the harms, so on and so forth. You're looking at losing 40% of the nerve endings in your penis. You're looking at really permanent, really serious, irreparable harm being done to millions and billions of infants against their will. Now, I think there is actually a separate kind of debate to be had about whether or not circumcision should be allowed for people over the age of 18 who give informed consent. But for the parents or grandparents or religious leaders to make the decision to carry out circumcision, we're in a situation right now where scientists, respectable PhD wielding scientists are willing to line up and say what is convenient instead of what's true. Why do they do this? Now, most people want to jump to the profit motive, okay? And I think probably if we went through enough of TJ's own videos, I think we'd find videos, because I've heard him making some kind of anti-capitalist statements where his mind is running wild this way, where the profit motive corrupts everything. I think a lot of people read this kind of book and they say, oh, well, the reason why these scientists are making excuses for drugs that don't really work and so on, it's the profit motive, it's money. I think if you really met these people, if you really spent time with these people, that would cease to be believable for you. Like if you look at what a stockbroker is doing on the stock market, well, all of it has to do with money. But it's not like you can pin down and explain a particular decision they made, whether it's a good decision or a bad decision. Oh, well, the problem with that decision he made on the stock market that day was that it was motivated by money. If you are a medical doctor, you ask a medical doctor, so why did you decide to specialize in toe fungus? People get fungal infections on their toes. You're not going to have a simple answer. Oh, well, it was money. Okay, you can make money being a specialist in toe fungus, right? And you can make money delivering babies as a medical doctor with the same credentials. There's money either way, right? I know it's going to sound ridiculous, but really, for these people in these specialized areas, all the people I know with PhDs, to say they're motivated by money, they sit there and they fill out a form requesting research funding. And a lot of them, they fill out 6 a year. Okay? I've never known someone personally who did that many a year. I've read about it. I've actually never personally known someone with a PhD who did 6 funding proposals a year, but it's out there. And I know there are some departments that have teams of people writing these research proposals, and one guy just signs them. It's like he's pretending it's his research proposal so that he can get out all these proposals every year. I personally did not know anyone like that. But anyway, whether they're doing 2 research proposals a year or 4, if you said to them, like, the research can be on anything. But we could use an example relevant to this discussion. They could be doing research on censorship. They could be doing research on the psychological effects of male circumcision. They could be doing research on something to do with antidepressants and their effect, unemployment as a long-term consequence of getting on psychiatric drugs. Is a great area of social science research. But to look at their particular research project and then say to them, well, you just did this for money. You just did this for the profit motive. The reality for them is they would make money no matter what research they did. Like, if they had proposed one project versus another, the amount of money coming in would be about the same. In the same way that, like, from the stockbroker's perspective, everything he's doing is related to money, but it's not like you can explain any one decision in this way as being exclusively about money. It's not something where you can hold up an idea of what an uncorrupt person would be or an incorruptible person would do in that scenario, and then contrast it to what actually happened and say, clearly, when we compare these two, we can see the difference the corruption made. All right. Money is a factor in all academic research and everything that people with PhDs do. And in a sense, it's meaningless because everything is equally corrupt. All options are equally corrupt. And again, if you talk to that medical doctor, there may be some exceptions, but it's not really something you can give a simple answer to. Like, okay, you used to be a heart surgeon. Why did you stop being a heart surgeon to go into fungal infections? There's going to be a story. There's going to be a reason. There's going to be some reason of a decision, but it is never going to be as simple as money. And I know this is going to sound stupid to you, but if you know these people, if you've eaten lunch with these people, if you know them face to face in a way that TJ, the amazing atheist, does not, you would know this. However much more money you would make working in fungal foot infections, if you made more money than doing heart surgery, the money would not be enough. It would not justify you doing fungal toe infections instead of heart surgery. Because for you, as someone in that position, whether it's that you already have a PhD, or you already have 20 years of medical training and education behind you, right? At that point, like the crucial factor that's going to make the decisive difference, it's not going to be money. All right. And I'm going out on a limb here and saying to you, when you look at the stupidity, the recklessness, the terrible harm done by scientists in every generation, including our own, scientists under communism in the Soviet Union, scientists under the Nazi Party in Germany, scientists under capitalist democracy in the United States of America, doing unspeakably awful, terrible things. All right. I am going to go to a limb and say to you, it's never the money, because they could have been making money 6 different ways. They'll make money no matter which option they do. And they'll make enough money. They'll make enough money doing heart surgery. They don't have to do breast augmentation, even if they make more. It's never going to be the factor that makes the decisive difference. Now, I'll say something. I'm now 42 years old, guys. I've been studying politics my whole life long. Did I start at age 11? When did I start studying politics? I don't know. Okay, guys, I kind of wish I did have a YouTube channel when I was younger, when I had more of a soft heart and when I got more hurt and upset by these things. I some of the things I've talked about with Melissa reminded me of that time in my life. I remember reading about horrifying experiments done on human beings by the CIA, by CIA partner agencies, CIA scientists. And I remember reading about the CIA assassinating some of the scientists who worked for them when they became inconvenient, And I remember my sense of horror and my sense of revulsion and my mind, I've been raised to be left-wing. My mind kind of automatically going into this left-wing downward spiral where it seems like everything America does is bad, evil, and wrong. You know what I mean? Where you start thinking America can't do anything right because they did this one thing wrong. I've got to tell you something. When I read that kind of stuff today, I don't see it that way. I don't feel about it that way. I've really changed. And I don't think it's that my heart has grown cold. I don't. All right. So, I just mentioned, I give many examples. The CIA actually did do experiments about whether or not they could traumatize someone enough to create a split personality so they could switch between multiple personalities. Okay, they did actually do, and it involved torturing people. From what I read, it probably did also involve raping people while they were under the influence of drugs. It was unbelievably horrible and unspeakable things that were done to try to traumatize people, to give them split personalities. From what I've read, this really does seem to be the case. And some of these psychological experiments, some people survived after being tortured and mistreated. They were vegetables afterwards. They were useless. They were severely mentally injured people having been through this. Okay. And I'll tell you something else I read about this particular set of experiments that involved traumatizing people. But it was something like they had 15 scientists on the project, and they kind of came to the end of the phase 1 report. So again, obviously this is from memory, and it's possible the source I was reading was wrong or based on misinformation. It's possible. I mean, it's possible. There are examples of seemingly factual documents about the CIA, and when you look into it, it turns out they're either wrong or grossly exaggerated. But I remember reading this back in my political science days. So let's say there were 15 scientists in the project, and they write the conclusions to the phase 1 report. And the scientists say, well, look, basically, we can't really proceed with this research without torturing people, because it seems like this split personality thing, it only basically happens when someone's so traumatized that they kind of start suppressing memories. So really, this is going to be kind of really unethical and involve torturing people or doing terrible things to people. It doesn't really make any sense. And so somebody in charge said, okay, fine. So anyone who doesn't want to go any further with these experiments, you can resign. I forget, out of the 15 scientists, like 12 of them resigned. And then some of them decided they want to stay and go further with the research. And they hired 7 new people or something. They hired protocol. Who wants to be involved in research about traumatizing people and seeing if they can have repressed memories and slippers? You can opt out. And, again, none of those guys, do you think any of them are poor? Do you think any of them are begging? Do you think anyone made this decision on the basis of money? Do you think the scientists who stayed in to torture people and see what happened, when you create split, do you think it was like, oh, well, I could be working on fungal foot infections. I could be doing something. Oh, but the money is really good. No, there's no way the money will ever be the decisive factor there. Never. Not for these people. And if you've met these people and spent time with these people, you'll know what I'm saying. Now, there are problems. I mean, I was saying before to you, dead serious. Now, we've digressed on to many other topics now. I think that these people, I think the scientists who torture people to death, I think the scientists that torture animals to death, and I think the scientists who created the whole, biopsychiatric for-profit complex that ruins millions of people's lives, I think they are morally worse than the small town Christian preacher whose practice in life is to hold some old woman's hand and cry with her, to sit with an old woman at the funeral and weep with her and talk to her. I mean, if it's Catholicism, maybe hear her confession. Protestants don't do that. To sit with someone and talk to them about the meaning of life and talk to them about death and talk about the death of their husband, and a preacher who's called in to talk to some teenage kid who's a brat and giving his parents a lot of trouble, and talk to this teenage kid about drugs and sex and video games and what it means to be a man. A lot of religious leaders do all these things. I knew Buddhist monks who were doing this stuff, and it's really not part of the Buddhist religion. But it was what the community needed. They need people who could go do this kind of thing. Even if at the beginning of your career as a religious leader, you're a person of absolutely zero moral character, right? There's a kind of praxis here that draws you into the study of human nature and helping human beings and caring about them and listening to them. And, yes, many of these preachers, they are encouraging prayer, which doesn't work. The drugs also don't work. In many areas of science, the drugs work. Vivisection doesn't work. Torturing animals to death doesn't work. Torturing monkeys to death just to see how unhappy they can be. It's a real example. I can give you links to articles. We've tortured animals to death for completely ridiculous reasons in the history of science. And, I'm using these examples because they're easy to cite, but they're very real. The whole corpus of Soviet Union science, the whole corpus of German Nazi science. I mean, sometimes you have this whole literature, a whole category of science that's complete bullshit. And these people were scientists, and they're still among us. There were scientists of that moral stamp, of that moral caliber. I am an atheist. I totally despise organized religion, but that does not mean that I share TJ Kirk, the amazing atheist, that I share this other YouTubers' naive, jejune embrace of scientists as if they are something superhuman. I'm really here to say to you instead that scientists, especially academically credentialed scientists, they really are some of the worst people in the world. They're so bad, they're so awful as individual people that I think you would find, in all honesty, they compare very poorly to the average religious leader. And so I'm going to pause and take a look at the comments from the audience. But look, I mean, all right, I just want to say, when TJ Kirk says, he said it in 2 separate videos in almost the same tone of voice, that he believes the government of the United States of America should have a special branch, a special division entirely staffed by properly credentialed scientists. You can just tell from the way he says that he believes in these people, and TJ, you believe in them because you don't know who they are. You don't know them face to face. You don't know the reality of who they are. I judge Napoleon by his sex life. Not only by his sex life. Napoleon was also racist. Napoleon was also pro-slavery, slavery of black people specifically. There are all kinds of things I judge Napoleon by. I think he was a terrible military strategist. I'm just being honest with you. Everyone says what a great military strategist he was, and he really wasn't. I'm a critic of Napoleon in many, many ways. A lot of people on the left, a lot of activists for atheism, they worship a guy called Bill Nye. Bill Nye, the science guy. Have you ever looked into Bill Nye's sex life? These people are not angels. And I'm just being real with you. They're not even good people. They're really not. I have a whole lengthy critique of universities, of the academic system in my book, No More Manifestos. And I don't intend to repeat that here. But within the disaster that is the 21st century university system, there's kind of a special ring of hell for the hard sciences. It's a terrible education system. It is selecting for terrible people, and it is making them into much more terrible people. I try to say something nice about scientists later in the video, but it's all right. I'll just so I think somebody's just Googled it. Someone's just Googled Bill Nye's sex life. Anyway, but look, isn't it easy for us all to heap scorn on the moral character of politicians? Why? Because you know them. Because they have some level of transparency. You see them, you hear their voices. You really think scientists are better people than elected politicians? Really? Really? Think about what I just said about the country priest who holds someone's hand while they're dying and who comforts the widow after her husband has died and does that again and again and again, who sees human sorrow and agony. I mean, again, even within the hospital, the doctor is in and he's out. The doctor comes in, he checks the medication, he walks out, and very often it's the priest who's sitting there with the person while they're dying, who's doing so-called palliative care, right? Think about the role of the priest in the community. Everything in life, whether it's new babies being born or drug addicts or gambling addicts, they're helping parents with their crappy teenage kids, giving morality lectures to people and so on. There's a way in which they are positively involved in human nature, no matter how ridiculous their religion may be, Think about the experience of politicians in the community in the same way. Think about, in the United States of America, whether it's a local city councilor or a mayor or a state senator or state congressman, someone who's not the president of the United States, but someone who's not particularly powerful, someone in the middle zone of being elected to government, but not at all being a dictator. The things they learn, the things they observe, in the economy and the struggles of life. They go and visit a school because they've read a newspaper article, or maybe they had a handwritten letter sent it from a parent saying, this school is a disaster. We need to have an intervention. And they go to the school. This is, just reality for most politicians. And they can see this is a terrible school. And they don't know what to do about it. This is a politician. Again, if you're just elected for the first time, this goes on for years. And they go and talk to someone and they investigate and they talk to the parents and they talk to the school administrator and they talk to the, okay, this school is terrible. They're involved in life, in questioning and in trying to solve problems. I mean, even if they start off being an idiot or being a terrible person, there's a process there, again, of them being involved in and engaged with human nature. And that is the exact opposite of the process of both the education and the career of scientists. Scientists are separated from reality, from the most important aspects of reality in all these ways and more. Okay, guys, I'm going to take a moment to look at your. So yeah, someone here knows the name Lysenko and Lysenkoism. I've mentioned him in my essays many times. He's probably been mentioned here on YouTube a couple times. I got a compliment for the live stream a couple days ago about incels, the cultural critique offered by incels, and the critique of incel. Thank you for that post, Human. Glad to hear you like the stream. I feel that's one of the best videos in the whole history of my channel, if my opinion counts for everything. I was very, very happy with that. Yeah, so Frida is mentioning some of the really ridiculous experiments done on dolphins. I've read about some of that stuff too. And a lot of that, I mean, what could the research have possibly proven? So a lot of you guys are talking about experiments on animals. There are also unbelievably terrible experiments on human beings. I remember this is when I was first getting into vegan activism. I found a website and it was just scientists. I don't think there were many scientists. I think there was like 2 guys ran this website. It wasn't a huge foundation, but it was scientists who were criticizing waste within scientific research, where it's like things are a waste of money. So that was a very interesting perspective. So they weren't opposed to torturing animals if it was for a real reason, if there was something really going to be discovered. But they had all these examples of huge amounts of money being spent and animals being tortured to death where it couldn't have possibly discovered anything. So one of them was an experiment where they took lambs, so baby sheep, lambs, and they threw them against a wall until their necks were broken. And then they x-rayed their necks. I think they dissected them and looked at the fractures. And they said, I mean, again, I'm reading there. I didn't read the original report. I read these scientists criticizing the study. But they said, look, the conclusions to the study basically admit, well, this study couldn't have possibly proven anything. They had to draw some conclusions. Like, well, as you can see, the ones that kind of hit with the left side of the neck got this kind of fracture. And when the impact was on this, they tried to draw some conclusions about this. But, it was like, well, we hoped we were going to draw some conclusions that are useful to understanding injuries to human beings in cars or something. But it's just really not there. So, the depth and extent and significance of just waste, just meaningless, pointless research. So there's a Wikipedia article called The Pit of Despair Experiments. That's what the Wikipedia article is called, and that's what they're referred to as. That was torturing monkeys to death for no reason. And the only point of this is a real series of scientific experiments. They're notorious. I mean, they're well-known people in many of the sciences. And the only thing it was trying to prove or could prove is that if you took a monkey and made it unhappy enough, it could never really be happy again. It's just like you can't really recover from something. Great, So, anyway, so Amelia Wood says that her neurologist, also a scientist with impressive credentials, is probably the least empathetic person I've ever met, period. Also one of the rudest. Well, and if your neurologist didn't have those characteristics before he or she entered university, they might be like that by the end, right? The process of both selection and preparation and inculcation. So I just mentioned this came up a lot years ago on this channel when we were talking about dietitians. And there are people who are scientists with PhDs in the sciences who are out there testing a hypothesis like, okay, how many grams of protein is optimal for losing weight or gaining muscle or something. But then there are also people who just have that experience of holding someone's hand and guiding them and coaching them as they lose weight and they gain the weight back again, like where it's the human reality of that experience of trying to motivate someone and keep them on track and trying to understand psychologically why the diet didn't work for them. Because most of the time, it's not a scientific problem. It's not like, it's not like, oh, well, this person didn't realize that eating potato chips was bad for them. No, they realized it and they didn't have the self-discipline, didn't have control. Where a lot of what you're dealing with is, this human reality, the human nature side of dietetics and nutrition. It's not, laboratory science. And, we have a system of education and you know exactly. I mean, just like you're a neurologist, what kind of person prepares for, studies for, and writes those exams. And then what kind of, what kind of attitudes and sense of entitlement they have coming out of that. That's another huge factor with this phenomenon with psychiatric medication, is also just that the people within this profession want to feel that they can push a button and solve a problem, that they can take a pill. So they want to feel that this is in the domain of science. And it's not. Most of which time, again, 95% of which time, is in the domain of human emotions, human misery. It's much closer to the domain of religion, or the domain of, indeed, a gym coach, someone trying to get you motivated and thinking positively so you can win the game or something. And, again, the gym coach, something else we can contrast to someone working in dietetics and nutrition, So no, I mean, partly the people who are produced by scientific education, they have assumptions about their own authority, their own role in the world, the way in which they ought to dictate reality rather than learn from it, which is, in a word, toxic. In a word, malignant, in a word, dangerous. And why do so many scientists become Nazis? Why do so many scientists become communists? There's nothing democratic about science, not as it's taught in our culture or any culture I know of in the last 200 years. It's a really twisted sort of aristocracy. Okay. Shout out to Brendan Williams. Thanks for saying that, Brendan. Brendan says that his most anticipated book is Heisel's upcoming book. So the book is titled No More Manifestos. We will see how quickly I wrap it up. I have a bunch of big decisions to make in my life, but I could wrap it up in just a couple of days. But I'm feeling like I should take a lot of time and try to make it perfect. Oh, Mercia asks, quote, "Do you have a video on female incels?" I'd like to think that all my videos about gender politics and so on, I think they all apply to all genders and all orientations. Yeah. So Brendan Williams is referring to the Pit of Despair experiments. I can give you guys that link. I mean, it's no big deal. I'm pretty sure it's on, as I mentioned, it's on Wikipedia. Did I say Pit of Despair? I think I got it right. Maybe I said Pit of Hopelessness or something. But anyway, there you go. There's the Wikipedia on that. I think Brendan Williams. No, so Willem McGeehan mentions MK Ultra. So yeah, so there's MK Ultra. There's Project Monarch, which was before MK Ultra. There were also experiments that are much less famous that took place over the border in Montreal, Canada. So most Americans don't know, but it was a CIA project in Montreal, torturing people. And why they did it in Montreal, I don't know. I don't care. But no, we have, you guys probably know there were experiments that are much resented. I forget, they were called the Tuskegee experiments, of intentionally giving sexually transmitted diseases to black men to see how they'd suffer. Maybe I'm, there you go, the Tuskegee syphilis study. There you go. I remember there were a lot of experiments done on Americans in prison having to do with skin conditions. Remember, there was a book about it that had the title Acres of Skin. So there's a link on that. As I remember, there was a quote from one of the scientists. Here it is. Oh, wow, I found the book. Shows I must have seen this book 30 years ago. Oh, still got it. Boy, in case you guys don't know, I drink zero alcohol. I use zero drugs. So I can remember this book. I probably saw this 20 years ago or something. Oh, okay. I can get that whole link in there. All right. I think the link I'm not allowed to share because it's just too long. So it's a book from 1998 called Acres of Skin, and it was given that title because one of the scientists involved in experimenting on American prisoners, he said, he regards the prison population, he regards this prison population as acres of skin to carry out his experiments on. Oh yeah, so the Bikini Atoll radiation experiments. I remember watching an interview with a survivor, and he was dying. I mean, he was dying of radiation poisoning, but he was dying more slowly. Some people died immediately. The Bikini Atoll radiation. So look, I take a lot of long walks with my girlfriend. We talk about a lot of things in depth. I reminded her earlier today in the context of a totally different discussion. I said, the reason why I left Buddhism, the reason why I quit Buddhism was not Buddhism. It was not any particular principle or theory or philosophy found in Buddhism as a religion. Put it this way. That's not why I left Buddhism. I gave up on Buddhism because of Buddhists, because of who Buddhists are, and I don't really mean this in a hypothetical sense. I had met and spoken with hundreds of Buddhists at all levels of education and speaking different languages and so on and so forth. Now look, if this sounds, some of you may think this is really unreasonable. Okay. How do you feel about rock and roll? How do you feel about devoting the next 10 years of your life to rock and roll? How do you feel about these 5 guys who are in the band with you? How do you feel about devoting all your time and energy to working with these 5 guys? All right. You're not making a judgment about rock and roll. You're making a judgment about this band. And you're making a judgment of this band that is based on who the people are in this band. Okay. So I'm not making a judgment about Buddhism as a text, as a theory, as a philosophy, right? I'm making a judgment about you and you and you and you. And yeah, it's more than 5 guys. But obviously there are a small number of people at the top certainly controlling what's going on in Theravada Buddhism and the academic study of Theravada Buddhism. There are 5 guys. Ultimately the Catholic Church is probably controlled by 5 guys at the top too. You know what I mean? The Pope and a few of his friends. You might quit the Catholic Church because you disagree with the Pope and you don't disagree with Catholicism, in theory. Yeah. I think people are eager to make judgments about science. And that's not what I'm encouraging you to do in this video. I'm telling you to make judgments about scientists. Who are these people? Who are the men and women with PhDs who rule this peculiar, completely undemocratic, completely, corrupt aristocracy within our society that we call science? I'm asking you to make a judgment about the people involved. Now, I would also point out, many of you tune into my channel to hear what I have to say about psychology. At this point, I think it's probably the majority of my audience. There is a sense in which, like many, many, many of my videos are about psychology. And you care about what I have to say, and people ask me for help about their own lives. We're talking about psychology. I think nobody here would say that they hate psychology or they disagree with psychology. Nobody would say abolish psychology. Nobody would say defund psychology, tear down psychology, right? Okay, so well, what do you think about psychology? Are we talking about theory? Are we talking about a text? Are we talking about Okay, now I ask you, what do you think about psychologists? Maybe, for many people here, maybe while you were in high school, you were sent to an office where you had to talk to a psychologist. I just read some really scary examples of that, of people having teenage encounters with psychologists. Have you ever asked for help, whether over the phone or face-to-face? You're dealing with some challenge in your life and you talk to a psychologist. Have you ever been going through a divorce or a breakup with your girlfriend or boyfriend and you talk to a psychologist? What do you think about that man? What did you think about that person or those people? Right? Oh, now we're thinking about something very different. Now we're not thinking about a theory. right? Now we're not thinking about a principle. Now we're not thinking about a text in the sense that the Bible is a text, or the ancient Buddhist philosophy exists inert and dead on paper. Oh, now we're talking about people. Okay. Oh yeah, those are terrible people. Oh yeah, all the psychologists I know, they're unspeakably terrible people. Oh God, that was awful. I mean, that was terrifying. Oh yeah, in theory, psychology could be this wonderful, positive thing in our lives. What an idea that people would study at university. And now immediately we start to move beyond that and say, okay, well, this can't just be a few bad apples, right? Why? Why are they terrible? Why are psychologists so bad, even if there's a sense in which psychology is so good? So you see why I'm saying this? There's a sense in which science is good, right? Why do I use toothpaste and a toothbrush? Science. There's this. Why do I? Why am I not getting cholera by drinking water out of this can? You know what I mean? How is it we know whether or not water contains cholera? And we design sewage systems so all of us get to shower and drink water out of a tap without worrying about cholera or getting sick. Oh, that's science. Oh, okay. We all have this unimpeachably positive view of science. Oh, okay. Now, what about scientists? Yeah, I'm not insulting you guys. You may or may not have lived a life where you really knew scientists and really knew them as people. Not at a distance, where you knew about their divorce and you knew about their sex life. You knew about the BDSM woman they visited. What's the word for that? Dominatrix they visited. Sorry, I'm not into BDSM. TJ is. He would know the sound terminology. Where you really know this scientist as a man. You know the depths of his souls. You know the whites of his eyes. You know him deep down inside. You know a scientist, and you know his excuses for not eating a vegan diet or whatever. You know him like that. Oh, well, okay. So if we think psychology is good but not psychologists, or if we think Buddhism is good but not Buddhists, like Buddhist philosophy in some sense, you think it's good and has some value or something. I mean, look, you may think Shakespeare is good, but you hate actors. You don't really like people who work in the theater, but you love Shakespeare. Okay. This is not a contradiction. This does not make you a hypocrite. They're two very different things, right? Okay. So we immediately have to press past this and start to ask ourselves, why? Why do psychologists have these terrifying authoritarian attitudes? You look at Jordan Peterson, to what extent is Jordan Peterson the product of his education? And to what extent is he going on to produce other people who are dysfunctional in the same way as an educator? I mean, he was a psychologist. He was also a professor of psychology, and I've pointed this out many times. He completely bought into the myth of biopsychiatry. He completely believed in antidepressants. He completely believed in benzodiazepines, right up until it put him in the hospital and almost killed him. And even then, in his book, there's one sentence in the appendix to his book where he just says that benzodiazepines are in theory harmless, but in practice, in reality, very dangerous. There's one sentence, obviously we start to ask tougher and tougher questions about education. Now, I've just written a book that talks a lot about this, because what I saw happening in the year 2020, and enough time has gone past, we can already see it's over. It's the past tense. Oh, why are police choking people to death? Why are police using chokeholds? Why are they doing these terrible things? And right away, what people issue is, it must be the system of education. It must be how police are educated. So in my book, I have many, many pages talking about this. The book does not talk about philosophy of science very much. It does not talk about what this video talks about in general. But, really? So the year 2020 came and went. The year 2021 is almost over now. Did even one person go to the police academy and get the reading list of what the textbooks actually are? Did anyone actually read the textbooks that are used to train police? Did anyone actually sit in the classroom and observe what they're taught and how? Was there any real interest in the analysis of police education, let alone its reform? It's very fleeting. It's very shallow. That we're so ready to blame education, and we don't seem to be ready at all to actually reform it, to actually analyze it. So on the one hand, I recognize it's inevitable that we're going to engage in a critique of psychology. It's inevitable we're going to engage in a critique of scientific education, even within a field of science like nutrition, of course. But I'm also tremendously skeptical, in a true, profound sense of skeptical. I'm very skeptical about that critique of education and where it leads next. Okay, guys, I'm now just going to return to your comments. There'll be a little bit of dead air as I look through this stuff. Okay, I thought there was a really interesting question in here that had the word democracy. A lot of intelligent comments. I'm glad to see you guys talking amongst yourselves. But what I don't understand is why we only have 15 thumbs up at this point. Far more of you should be hitting the thumbs up button so people could have joined the conversation. Okay, so maybe this is going to be the last question from the audience for me to close on. So plant-based powered, it's good. You're asking about Jordan Peterson. Well, he's credentialed, right? If you have the PhD, you have the credential. Nobody questions anything beyond that, right? Who is a doctor and who is not a doctor? There's a piece of paper that they have nailed to the wall. It says they're a doctor. So that's it. So they become an authority figure. Nobody elected them, nor can they ever lose an election. Can never be called into question this way. Okay, totally fair comment from Frida. Frida says, quote, and I think psychologists' position of authority often translates into abusive relationships with the patients. Okay, Frida, I would go a step further. I think by definition, it's an abusive relationship. So, I remember Melissa talked to some kind of therapist, right? Back when Melissa was first falling in love with me and thinking about moving to China to be with me, right? She meets and speaks to this woman, what are you going to talk about? Yeah, I'm thinking about moving to China. Well, now you need to talk to somebody who knows something about China. Now, maybe this psychologist is so sheltered and unworldly and they don't know anything about. Oh, well, that's crazy. Oh, wow, you must have some delusion. There must be something wrong with you that you've fallen in love with someone who moved to China. Maybe you talk to a psychologist who says, oh, yeah, they've been to China on vacation. No, where are you going? This is all just totally subjective. All right, sorry. This is a really deep issue. But I was talking to Melissa the other day, and she said in passing, well, I'm not a doctor, but, and she meant medical doctor. I'm not even going to bother saying what the conversation, but you can imagine. She said, well, I'm not a doctor, but I'm certain about this and this. She was just going to say, I let her finish her sentence, finish her paragraph. I said, look, I've got to jump in on that issue of going around saying, I am not a doctor, but think about how little medical doctors know about any one of these issues. If you're not talking about someone who happens to be a specialist in this field, who happens to have a personal research interest, I took an interest in Cambodia for several years. So I read a lot about Cambodia, but being a doctor or not being a doctor has no bearing on that. You can see so many doctors who have some competence in something. They had maybe they had a lot of training with how to deal with a broken arm, but they're put in a position of being an expert about vegan nutrition. So I knew a vegan. She was a mother with a small child, and she got a phone call from a doctor, proper medical doctor who was fully credentialed, because the school put the doctor up to it. So it was like the school. So the teacher talked to the principal of the school, and the principal phoned this doctor, and then the doctor gives her this phone call. The doctor's basically been told by the school authorities to call this parent and put them in order and say that she has to feed her child meat because there's no source of protein in a vegan diet. There's a phone call from a doctor. Well, what does that doctor know about veganism? What does a psychologist know about China? What does a psychologist know about your relationship with your boyfriend? And so there was all these obvious, flaws in the system. Well, they only know what you tell them, right? And their own prejudices and biases and their own cultural background, all this stuff. Oh, they don't get to hear the boyfriend's perspective. My father was a liar. He lied about everything. I've never met his therapist. I know he had a therapist for many years. If I met his therapist would be blown away. He'd be like, well, you're a totally different person from what your father described. Of course, my father wasn't capable of telling the truth about me. I mean, if he wanted to tell you the truth about me, he couldn't. He was constantly lying about everything, but basically anything that touched his ego. he would lie about. So he'd be lying constantly about his relationship with all his kids, lying about everything. He was not delusional. He was a liar. They're two different things. He was intentionally lying constantly. What does a therapist know when they're talking to a compulsive liar? Okay. But, my point is I'm actually willing to go much further and say, no, it doesn't matter how nice, how friendly, the relationship between the psychologist and the patient is. I think that relationship with authority, it's always abusive, right? And I'll tell you two things right now. Coming back to the title of this video, it's never scientific and it's never democratic. What we've done is set up an academic ideal of the sciences that is in every way the opposite of democracy. It's not just incompatible with democracy, right? But it undermines the most basic concepts of democracy. And that psychologist can never be made accountable. That psychologist can never be drawn up before the Pnyx and voted out of office or voted to go fight in the front lines in Iraq. Now, I always forget this guy's name. Was it Cleon in ancient Athens? So there was this marvelous figure in Thucydides in the history of Athens. So the guy's name was Cleon, and the author here is Thucydides. Do some reading. All right. There's this wonderful drama that unfolds in Thucydides. Thucydides describing to you the way democracy really worked in ancient Athens. And Cleon is cross-examining and criticizing the guys who are in charge of the war effort, the political leaders or military leaders, both in charge of the war. And he ends one of his speeches where he's, this is part of democracy. He's criticizing what goes on. And he says something like, if I were put in charge of this war, I would win that battle and bring back victory within 30 days. Now, maybe it was 2 weeks. I forget the number of days, but he says something like this. He says, within 30 days, he said something like, I would win that battle or die trying. And, that'd be it. This would be over. And he left. He walked out of the arena. I don't know if he just did that for dramatic effect or but he left. And after he left, they had a vote. They voted to send him off to lead the war. And it's openly said, they were laughing about it. They said, well, either he wins or we'll be rid of him. Like either he wins or he dies. And if he dies, then we don't have to put up with him anymore as a political leader. Now, the rest of the story is very interesting. Eventually, he does die, but he has some victories before he has some defeats. And whether Cleon is a hero or a villain, is an important question. Okay, so Jordan Peterson, how many people did he put on SSRI antidepressants? How many? And by the way, I know the procedure. Sorry, in case you don't know it, I've heard Jordan Peterson himself describe it. He would recommend that a patient take one of these drugs, and then he would walk across the hall with the patient and introduce them to the doctor who would do the prescription. He didn't directly give the prescription because in the Canadian system, that's how it works. He has to go get another doctor to do it. But nevertheless, okay, there's no accountability for the fact that Jordan Peterson recommended that his own patients take exactly the same drug that destroyed his life, that his own patients took the same class of drugs, benzodiazepines, the same class of drugs that he now knows are dangerous, that he knows are deleterious, that he knows ruined his whole life. There's no accountability. There's never going to be a vote. There's never going to be a debate, right? Oh, gee, yeah, those scientists who did those horrible experiments in the Bikini Atoll. Was there any democratic accountability? There is no democracy to our system science at any stage, not in the education system, not in the assignation of research funding, not in being responsible for even using taxpayers' money in an effective way. That has been debated recently by Rand Paul in the American Senate. I was thinking about making a YouTube video about it, but I decided not to. He's put on a hilarious display of research that the government gave millions of dollars to, and there was complete waste of money. One of them was like a comparative study of bird calls when birds are mating, whether or not their mating behavior changes due to trivial reasons. It was all kinds of scientific research. I mean, stupid, pointless. The outcome was obvious, and this is government money, taxpayers' money, and there's no accountability. So it's not just undemocratic; it's fundamentally anti-democratic. And they have the impunity that aristocrats once had, a type of impunity that police officers also carry with them in our society. The credentialed experts, and they're experts on what you feel. They're experts on what you think and what you know. And they can medicate you, and they can literally put you in chains, and they can lock you up in an institution. They have all these powers given to them on the basis of what? On the basis of a credential. Because what they're doing, it is neither scientific nor is it democratic. It has no scientific validity. It has no objective reality. There's nothing verifiable about it. And these are the people, coming back to the basic premise of this video, these are the people that the Amazing Atheist wants to put in a position of political power to be able to censor what you are able to say on Facebook and YouTube and in the newspapers and everywhere else. Whatever it is they regard as a scientific certainty. Well, guess what? They regarded Prozac as a scientific certainty. It's been debunked. Still today, 95% of Americans don't realize that it's been debunked. How about Haldol? I made a video just about the drug called Haldol, which is pretty scary, pretty scary effects in terms of brain damage and so on and so forth. So, I mean, partly this is talking about our concept of science, and generally, though, what I'm instead directing our attention to is the question of who are scientists, humanizing scientists, not dehumanizing them, but regarding them as people. And it seems to me so easy to vilify religious leaders. It seems to me so easy to vilify political leaders, but they have some transparency. They have some accountability. Scientists have none. So referring to this question from Mr. Kurtz, hope you're still in the audience, Mr., if I may call you Mr. Anyway, Mr. Kurtz is the name given here. Mr. Kurtz asks simply, how can we make science more democratic? Okay. So, what am I supposed to say? Read my book. I mean, again, my book doesn't really deal with science per se, but it deals with education. It deals with university education, with occasional references saying that my critique of how universities work very much applies to the sciences. Then it talks about police brutality. It talks about democracy a lot. It talks about how constitutions are written, so on and so forth. Okay, great. Good to see you here, Kurtz. Glad to see you're here. Okay. It's a great question. I wasn't prepared to talk about this. Not that I do any preparation for these videos. Legislation largely is based on animus. All right, now this is animus in its legal sense. What democracy, tends to cope with quite well is a specific resolution for a specific purpose that forbids a specific thing. That is our legal tradition, and that's most of what we think about as democracy. What we think about as democracy in the 21st century is having a council of people come together to debate what should and what should not be forbidden. So up to a certain point in our history, homosexuality was forbidden. Then we had protests and we had cultural change and what have you. We had political activism, right? And at some point we decided, no, we're going to permit and even encourage homosexuality. We're going to have gay marriage and we're going to make gays equal and more, right? Oh, okay, so something was forbidden. Now it's not forbidden. Okay, it used to be that racism was compulsory. And then we made racism forbidden. This is a good example because we all know, you can compare from country to country. I mean, this is true from one country to the next in Europe. What does it mean to make racism forbidden? I just applied. Sorry, I shouldn't say applied. I had an interview with a university in order to apply to become a student there. And I was refused for being a Jew. This is in California, in the United States of America, in the year 2021. So racism is forbidden. Discrimination on the basis of religion is forbidden. And it's still ongoing. Now, they can tell you exactly how that's justified under the American Constitution, so on and so forth. But, we have a problem. I mean, obviously, I could say a lot more about the difference between direct democracy and indirect democracy. But we have a whole tradition of what is law and order, that is really just based on forbidding things. Okay, now, how do you build a school? Read your Constitution. What does it say about schools? I'll point out, this is fresh in my mind for different reasons. The American Constitution, the federal Constitution, says nothing about schools. Nothing. What they wrote in the American Constitution in the 1780s. No interest. But look at the Constitution for the state of Maine, written in 1820. Some of the same people were still alive from writing the federal Constitution, the Constitution of the United States of America, including Thomas Jefferson. He was still alive, and he participated in writing the Constitution for the state of Maine. Now there are several paragraphs talking about state involvement in education. It's brief and it's vague, and it's also forbidding something. So actually, this illustrates my point further. What does it say about education? In the Constitution of the state of Maine, it forbids the government to give money to any school unless that school is willing to allow the government to make decisions about education. Like a school can't remain independent with it. Okay, it's interesting. Very limited statement. All right. How do you create scientific attitudes amongst the general public? How do you create, frankly, an elite, of expert scientists? We have a society that has not yet gotten to the point of even being willing or capable to make circumcision illegal, to make cutting off part of your penis illegal because of your sacred covenant with the Judeo-Christian God. We're so completely stuck on this issue of forbidding, and the opposite of forbidding being liberating, being rights, so on and so forth, that, I think the most honest answer I can give you is that, we have not yet begun to really talk in any meaningful sense about the relationship between democracy and science. Yeah, thanks, guys. I am seeing your comments as they come in. I know the video from Jordan Peterson you're talking about. I know the stuff you're talking about. And by the way, thanks for watching my other live streams about incels and these other topics. And thanks for the encouragement to grow my beard longer. Somebody's a fan of the beard. Okay. I feel like one of the biggest mistakes we've made is in actually separating democracy from the judiciary, from the role of the courts. Most people today, most people with PhDs in political science, for example, and most normal people, they'll use less academic language. They talk about democracy now entirely in terms of the question of who gets what. So the government has an enormous amount of money, and then how it doles out those privileges, those programs, how it funds things, then that becomes the debate. So this is a sense in which the social services state has kind of blotted out the last memory of what democracy was supposed to be in a more ancient and a more meaningful sense. Well, that's not the only aspect to democracy. Another really important aspect of democracy has to do with accountability, has to do with judgment, has to do with creating consequences for our actions. And I've said this before, I will probably say it again. If you want to understand Athenian democracy, you can try to understand theater. They went to the theater and they voted. They voted for who would win, who had the best song, who had the best comedy, who had the best tragedy. Audiences voted at the theater. They went to court. They had an enormous jury. It was just like the theater. They had a huge audience who would hear the arguments and they would vote. And people would be punished and people would die on the basis of the vote from the audience. In case you haven't heard, they killed Socrates. Aristotle fled for his life. When Aristotle ran away from Athens, he was convinced or presumed that he was going to be put on trial and killed if he stayed in Athens any longer. Just to mention that Socrates' experience was not necessarily completely, if you're talking about the democratization of science, okay, I'll give you a real quick parallel. Oh boy, this is a long time ago. Can anyone remember 2008? I remember a conversation. Boy, I have to think where it was. I remember a conversation on broadcast television. So this is probably CNBC or MSNBC or whatever they had back then. And it was about making changes to the government oversight of the stock market at the last minute, kind of as the crisis was setting in or just before the crisis. And I remember the reporter, the journalist, who obviously he seemed to have real expertise in these things. He said sincerely, I think there's this really fundamental mistake we're all up against, which is that people in power think that the guys making money on Wall Street, the stockbrokers and hedge fund managers, that the guys making money on Wall Street and the government regulators ought to get along and be great friends. And he said, no, you want Wall Street to be afraid of the government. You want the regulators, people they are terrified of. You do not want this to be a cooperative or positive, happy relation. For me, that hints at this aspect of democracy. Why are our universities so poor? Our professors have total impunity. Our professors are simply aristocrats among us. Never once do our professors worry, if I teach this, what will the Pnyx make of it? What will Parliament make of it? In what way will I be held accountable in this democracy? In what way will I have to stand on trial, as Socrates once did, and present an apology, present a defense of my views of what I'm teaching? And never forget, that's what Socrates was put on trial for. He was put on trial for what he was teaching the youth, because some of the youths he had been teaching had gone on to be politically notorious people, most notably Alcibiades. The idea that a teacher should be brought before the people, not the Senate, not the Congress, but the Pnyx, direct democracy. The idea that a teacher should be accountable for what they're teaching, the idea that a student could bring a teacher in to be held accountable in a democracy, this is completely died and been forgotten. So I'm giving the most sincere answer I can here. If you're asking about how could science be made democratic, I would say that, in the same way that news broadcaster had the honesty to say, you need Wall Street to be afraid of the government regulators, not to be cooperating with them or happy or controlling their appointment or capturing them, whatever, not feeling that they're working together for the same interests. I've got to tell you something. I think that people like Jordan Peterson, pardon me, I think that people like Jordan Peterson should be afraid to harm their patients. I think that they should be afraid to preach quack medicine, debunked pseudoscience, quack medicine to their own students. I think Jordan Peterson should be afraid to teach his ridiculous theory about the eye of Horus. He has all these crazy theories about ancient religion that can be debunked too. I think he should be afraid to teach complete bullshit because I think he should feel that he's accountable and he's accountable to his students and that he's accountable to the real world outcomes. Like, well, how many of your students, how many of your patients actually got better after taking this cure? And I think he should be accountable to the people in a democratic sense. So if you're asking me in what way, can science be made more democratic? I have to say I'd really start with talking about consequences, the way in which democracy can and should create consequences for our choices, consequences for our actions. And now we've drifted so far away from that momentarily in the year 2021. People are asking, what went wrong in Afghanistan? Who's responsible? Who's accountable? Will there be even one military leader who's brought in and put on trial? And a trial in some sense, just an inquest, an inquiry, a cross-examination. I mean, I'm not even saying there have to be criminal charges, where they will be blamed and they will be interrogated and the evidence will be gathered together and analyzed and say, maybe I doubt it. Honestly, in the American system, it's probably not a military leader. It'll probably be a political leader who was a strategist, whether they were with the State Department or the EOP or the, whichever branch they're with. They could be with the Pentagon, but whatever. One of the branches of the federal government. Who was it that made these decisions? Maybe it was George W. Bush himself, and maybe not. I'm just saying the extent to which George Bush was on autopilot. That's another question. But we have no concept. We have no expectation whatsoever that anyone will be brought in and questioned and held accountable. Certainly not to the extent of Socrates, and certainly not to the extent of anyone else. We had this brief, fleeting fascination in the year 2020 that someone should be accountable for the fact that police are choking people to death, right? But there's no Phoenix, there's no trial, there's no, right? Nobody's going to question who taught the police to use these chokeholds, who taught these procedures, who created this curriculum, who created these rules, and they will be particular people. It's partly laws, it's partly standards and procedures, and there is a question not just of changing the laws you've got, but of really having a culture of accountability, of democratic accountability in that sense. Okay, guys, so I'm ready to wrap up this video now. We're talking about science, we're talking about democracy, and I think we have drifted away from the issue of censorship. But maybe this puts censorship in a very different context, doesn't it? Okay. One type of censorship is preventing you from saying something you want to say. Another type of censorship is silencing what you've said so that it cannot reach an audience or reaches the smallest audience possible. I think that's very much what The Amazing Atheist is talking about in his videos. But there's another type of censorship, right? There's a type of censorship that's truly democratic that says, well, you can say what you want, but you are going to be accountable. You are going to be held responsible for the consequences. And we don't do that to school teachers, and we don't do that to university professors. We don't do that to scientists, and we don't do that to police officers. I've written a whole book advancing the thesis that the fundamental problem with our democracy is that within the larger circle of a supposedly democratic system, a supposedly democratic society, we've created myriad smaller circles, small hierarchies that can indeed be described as aristocratic. So we are living through still now, in my opinion, a period of aristocratic science that has yet to be challenged by any paradigm that I could call a democracy of scientific knowledge. And so it is unthinkable to someone like The Amazing Atheist to truly have a democratic system of censorship.